The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition.
All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America.
To America after having fighting over in Vietnam.
Almost the same way as before I left. And when I say this, because when a man goes to fight for his country and then come back over here and have to almost fight for his life, in certain parts of the country, get ridiculed and discriminated, and be less than a man. I don't think it's right,
Hello, y'all, and welcome to the Dugout. This week, we're going to talk to you about a little bit of an extension of our thoughts around electoralism, what Black folks and folks that have been striving for autonomy have thought about, and how we've used the vote as a tool. And we're here to think beyond the ballot.
It just really pisses me off the way that Black people are weaponized every presidential election season. And I feel like this kind of really came into my mind after Kamala started running, and recently when Kamala did a campaign special with Oprah Winfrey. And like all the twinks for Harris and hotties for Harris and teachers for Harris and white guys for Harris. And I just think the way that identity is yielded and fashioned for the purpose of empire is extremely fascinating. And I'm very much anti-voting personally in a lot of ways. Like, I will never argue against people that want to use it to push for local issues and change material conditions. But in terms of the ultimate goal of like liberation or decolonization, I'm just like, I don't know. And that's just one thing. But I do think it's important to contextualize how voting has operated as a tool towards Black autonomy in the past, what the different frameworks around that have been, and what Black people have really been rightfully contending with, which is a system and a government that is built on genocide and enslavement, and that locks periodic population out. And so I'm really interested in respecting the Black struggle towards voting rights, but also being like, at what point are we kind of past it?
Especially when we think about the kind of labor that needs to be done to sustain a voting struggle, or voting or the electoral system as a site of struggle. I think one thing I'm excited to get into is looking at the tactic, but also trying to analyze the DIY nature of Black existence in politics and what that means for how we wield the tools in our toolbox. I'm looking at it now. 66% of Americans voted in the 2020 election, and that was the highest since 1990. It's usually around 47 to 50% of people that actively vote, of people who are eligible voters. And that's not talking about people who have their voting rights already stripped away. And I think just at the top of this, or do we want to talk about this at some point later? Voting in any electoral system or disenfranchisement and what it means to fight against it. I guess that's kind of what we're getting to.
Well, that'll definitely come through like discussions about the Voting Rights Act and perspectives on it even then, because it's like that's voter suppression and disenfranchisement is, it's both historical and it's literally around us today, which I think is also interesting when people are like, but they fought for your right to vote. You gotta vote. And I'm like, hold up. There were people that didn't want to leave the plantation. And there are people that left the plantation, or the people that burnt down the plantation. I don't know. So I think of it from that historical standpoint where, yes, of course, it's important to oppose people that are restricting our human rights. But I also am interested in even questioning the state's narrative of what a Black political life is, or what a Black citizen is. And I think starting from there is what is even more useful to me. But I also, I'm interested in it because I'm like, don't give my mom her vote. But do I want to vote? No.
And you have now what people fought for is that means something to the state. That's an inignorable excuse or inignorable action to the state.
Yeah. But what do you say to people that are just like, when you don't vote, it's a vote for Trump?
I just threw my hand up in the air and just shrugged, because it's one of those things that materially is not even necessarily true. But it does and can lead to better electoral positions for Trump. And it's not a vote for Trump. And I think that's the difference of like the framing of it that folks are having the issue around having it, especially with like, this is the closest the Green Party has ever had to actually being able to get federal funding next year to actually start winning local races so that they could start not only just trying to fail upwards, just like the fucking Democrats, but who knows? The civil rights movement, 1950s, what started it?
Well, I think it's important to kind of think about, I think the struggle for Black autonomy precedes, of course, the civil rights movement, but I kind of was interested in starting there because I think that's where a lot of Black political body and thought is towards targeting voting or the system of voting as a way to shift the Black experience. I feel like previously, I don't know, I'm thinking of like legislation, of like, you're not slaves anymore. And it's like, oh, great, until Juneteenth. Or, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And so-
13th Amendment, but we still need the 14th, 15th to get the right to vote. And even that doesn't really secure it because we're still fighting against disenfranchisement.
The right for the Black vote, I think, is very central, of course, to all of the other major issues in the civil rights movement. But to hit a few of the flashpoints that were in the 1950s that kind of led to the major flashpoints that we'll kind of dig more into in the 1960s, meaning like the assassinations of various leaders, the formation of the Black Panther Party, the kind of even the passing of the Voting Rights Act in, 1965? But in the 1950s, we have Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which is a landmark Supreme Court decision that declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. And this overturned the separate but equal clause. And while this was a major victory, it faced intense resistance in southern states where a lot of schools refused to desegregate, or even some in the North resorted to desegregation busing. And then we can look at 1955, the brutal murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi after he was falsely accused of whistling at a white woman, and how this open casket funeral became one of the most enduring images of the civil rights movement, and how this was another flashpoint of this is the extent that Black people suffer under next to no political representation, or no political representation whatsoever. And then we can look at the mid-1950s, the Montgomery bus boycotts, which were sparked by Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery to a white man. And this fueled a bus boycott campaign that lasted literally over a year, which is fucking wild and amazing to think about, all of the things that they had to move around, and like the local initiatives and formations of mutual aid, and how this kind of catapulted Martin Luther King Jr. into kind of the kind of national, international kind of eye. Then you have the Little Rock Nine, which were 9 students in 1957 who tried to attend Central High School and faced all sorts of like racism and, I don't know, to me, racial terror. And then we have the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, which was founded by Martin Luther King Jr. and other Black ministers and activists, so Ella Baker as well. And this organization basically used nonviolent protests and civil disobedience to protest segregation, racial injustice. One of their major impacts were the variety of sit-in movements that were across the South. And then we can go into the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first civil rights legislation passed by Congress since Reconstruction. While the act was relatively weak, focusing on aspects of voting rights, it established the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and allowed federal prosecution for those interfering with people's rights to vote. And this can be considered a flashpoint because it shows at least some of the public pressure being reacted to by our federal government. And that is kind of a breakdown of the 1950s. But the reason we also wanted to bring up the 1950s is because in 1955, Martin Luther King gave a speech called Give Us the Ballot, which I think is one of the first pieces of media that I was interested in digging into in this conversation. Because for me, it's just very interesting framing that MLK is offering. And I actually want to play a bit of it for both of us right now and the podcast. And this is from the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. And I'll just play a little bit of it for folks to listen to.
This noble and sublime decision has not gone without opposition. This opposition has often risen to ominous proportions. Many states have risen up in open defiance. The legislative halls of the South ring loud with such words as interposition and nullification. But even more, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. So our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and love mercy. And we will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tang of the human, but the glow of the divine. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17, 1954. In this juncture of our nation's history, that is an urgent need for dedicated and courageous leadership.
And I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to know what that makes you think of. That's Martin Luther King Jr. in 1955. And this is what, shortly, like around the time that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is forming, which I think is really telling and interesting. But yeah, what does that make you think and feel?
It makes me feel like they were way too optimistic and not understanding how the state works, and also how even with the vote, it doesn't mean lack power in the way that like Kwame Ture will come to define and Black Panther Party will come to define once this act gets passed and they continue to see the degradation of Black society. I think that it makes me also but at the same time I'm hearing like this possibility and this beautiful democratic urge for what sounds like and what they're envisioning is an optimistic and utopian vision of a nation within the nation and the uniting of the Black colonies or the internal colonies. And I just don't feel like, I feel like that's something that we got more fledged out from them once they got to see the realities of their years of political endeavor.
It makes me feel so many things when I listen to that, because I think of the fact that he was trying to imagine a reality that Black people hadn't seen yet, a way of existing in this country that hadn't been possible yet, meaning having any form of political representation. Because I'm looking at some statistic now. I mean, the Give Us the Ballot speech was in 1955. At least in 1957, when the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed, at that point, only 20% of Black people were even registered to vote, because there was that much disenfranchisement, suppression. I mean, like state sanctioned suppression, like how today we could even see then leads to extrajudicial violence, like the KKK. And so I think through MLK's conception of it, it's like this kind of is the only way that we have right now, because what are we going to do? Like burn down the White House and then get in boats to go back to Africa? Like that conception of like some of that Pan-Africanism would happen later. But in a way, it's kind of...
But I mean, this is after Garvey. It kind of feels like the ballot or the bullet speech. They're like, if you give us the ballot, we're able to control the mobs, as they were kind of saying.
Yeah.
And these are things that you won't have to deal with as a federal government, because through states' rights, we'll be able to take over the state legislatures in the places where we're highly populated, but capital will not allow that. Voting inside the organization and through different means, and like trying to come through different democratic processes or come to different understandings and confederations. So I think there's the beauty in that sort of connection and what that makes you feel.
Yeah.
And I just think there's something like the people in the 70s would also talk about how revolution was right around the corner. And the US was pretty destabilized, but global capital wasn't fallen in the 70s or the 80s. But it was definitely taking hits, and like it was building towards something beautiful, which is why it had to be attacked like it was. And the same as MLK and, folks in the civil rights movement, where they were assuring political enfranchisement.
At this time, if you would have heard this speech, you would have been in the audience like,
I would have said the judges. Wait, what was... I mean, probably not, because I probably would have been hanging out with Ella Baker. So, I mean, I would have been like literally getting paid by the federal government to go start worker councils.
Okay.
So like, and like there's like the Working Men's Association, and a part of like the things that were coming out of Reconstruction that were like mainly being taken over by military officers, and folks were organizing that the Reconstruction work be done by Black folks. And also, I mean, who knows? Emma Goldman was around. I think the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti happened again, so there was some like dead anarchists and shit. And the Communist Party was fucking with the struggle at this time a little bit too, when they were like having legal teams and being able to like go around like the anti-lynching laws. I think it was the same lawyer that did some of the anti-lynching laws that was the lawyer for Sacco and Vanzetti, the Italian anarchist that got hung. It's an interesting touchstone, because it's speaking to all the work that folks like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, all the way to Sojourner Truth were talking about when it comes to organizing around freedom, having something that is actually based off the communal relations that we're making when we're trying to fight and when we're in this struggle. How it starts the Black Power movement of like these laws are in place. I mean, when did the Civil Rights Act
of 1960 as well? There were numerous, of course there were numerous Civil Rights Act, but just from looking at that one a little bit, the Civil Rights Act of the 1960 worked to address a lot of the shortcomings of the 1957 Act by expanding the authority of federal judges to protect voting rights, and by requiring local authorities to maintain comprehensive voting records for review so that the government could determine if there were patterns of discrimination, etc. And I guess I'll say, kind of to some of your points, I feel like I am inspired by what MLK is presenting, because I kind of just view it as like a particular part of the Black establishment trying to form like a legible way forward. And whether or not that legible way forward is based in nonviolence, whether or not it's based in trying to meet your oppressor halfway, whether or not it's based in the oppressor agreeing to some kind of promise of progress for you, I think those are all things that are highly up for debate. And I think we're critical of a lot of those things. And I think a lot of people around that time were. But like what I think is interesting is that through all of the direct action and protest and civil disobedience that the civil rights movement, especially from the violent perspective, had to deploy, they had to also have those systems of mutual aid, of taking care of each other, because in their confrontation of the state, they had to do illegal things and then have the state turn against them even more for their suffering to then become legible. And how, if we're looking at the shift from like the civil rights movement, and how a lot of it was the desire for autonomy, but it was like legal autonomy and legibility, and how the Black Power movement, I think, was turning more towards self-determination, community control, and it was kind of less concerned with state-sanctioned permission of that like Black autonomous space. And I think like that to me is like an interesting distinction and shift in what happens.
That kind of comes in with like the influence of SNCC, especially with like Kwame Ture talking about Black voting, like right before the Black Panther Party gets started in 1966.
If you look at the Africans in the Democratic Party, now I'm not a Democrat. I've never voted in my life in the Democratic Party, and I never vote in the Democratic Party. It's racist and it's capitalist to the core. This is understood. And I shed my blood. I shed my blood for the vote now. I want to make that clear. Some people get confused. The vote for me has never been the road to liberation. It's only the means of organizing my people. I know that. I've seen, I was a young man in Harlem when they disbarred Adam Clayton Powell. Harlem had no representation. We continued to eat and sleep and take drugs and continue life just like always when Julian Bond was elected, when we were young in SNCC in Atlanta, Georgia, and they refused to seat him because of his position against the war in Vietnam. The Africans in that area, his congressional district, continued life just as we've not been having any mayors, and we've been having life, and even with the mayors now, the quality of life has not improved at all. So I've known the vote is never what? You vote for once in 4 years and that's your political responsibility? That's the height of bourgeois propaganda, making the people politically irresponsible, thinking their irresponsibility is limited to a one-day vote. Well, politics is every day of every minute. You have to be aware of what's going on, not voting on one day. So the vote has never meant anything. So I'm not a Democrat.
They give a speech, they talk about the vote. What like merely gaining the right to vote is insufficient. Political systems, like the political system itself here in the US, is designed to uphold white supremacy and economic exploitation. And after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, SNCC began to question, who do we vote for? Do we to have our needs met? And this reflection of the growing awareness that the right to vote had been secured, but voting alone was not enough to address the broader systemic issues that Black communities faced, such as economic inequality, police brutality, and inadequate housing, led to an expansion of sources, an expansion of influences, of where folks were establishing their revolutionary history and becoming revolutionaries. Or they're more establishing their autonomous histories and becoming revolutionaries through that, through learning about the violence that this system enacted to build itself, and then the hypocrisy of it saying that any violence, even something as small as a riot or property destruction when someone is lynched, is grounds enough for a whole population to be degraded and outlawed. And I think that's where the Black Panther Party strategy comes out of, because like they're informed from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in the Lowndes County. I can't remember what the act is. I think that's the name of the county, of where they had the Black Panther, and Kwame Ture was touring with that Panther thing around. SNCC was going around doing voter drive things. Ella Baker was a part of SNCC and other groups doing these drives, and it was something that you could meet people's needs with, or something that you could meet people's direct concerns around. which is like the framing of we can't even vote. We can't even get that done correctly, or we can't even get that done legally. And that's how little they care about our well being.
I think of all the things that were shifting, like perspectives on like Black participation or Black suffering. Like, I think about like the Vietnam War and how you're sending niggas to Vietnam
Drafted.
when they didn't even have here. And I guess I've kind of mentioned that because I think of the expanding of Black conceptions of like self-governance and autonomy. It's like not only do we need to struggle for autonomy on this land, but we also need to struggle away from participation in what the US imperialism and genocide is trying to do elsewhere. And I think that shift as well is something that I think is like deeply interesting and necessary, because it's like near the end of his time, MLK was advocating for like us to be clear about the horrors of what Vietnam is. He was expanding into more economic justice in terms of like the janitorial strike. And so it's also interesting to look at the 60s and like the Black struggle for autonomy, like through the lens of voting. But then I think what the US became capable of, or what we knew the US was capable of, like our conception of that even expanded. It's like they call it the American War in Vietnam. So I'm just like, I don't know. It's like that to me is just really wild. And it makes me, I don't know, I just think that shift is something that's really, really cool. And I feel like that's like in a lot of what Kwame Ture is kind of talking about as well.
Yeah, and a lot of SNCC were talking about how they were reading a lot of Fanon. They were influenced by the people's struggles in Angola and all this stuff that was popping off in the homeland over in Africa. They were being influenced by folks that really grounded them in what to do in solidarity with the third world, in solidarity with folks who are under the same global exploitation, but also feeling the brunt of imperialism, not from within the core, as one of the exterior, one of the exterior colonies or one of the exterior imperial fields. Anarchists, I think, don't engage with the state enough generally, unless they're being completely combative, which I think is fine for the most part, other than taking the serious questions of like looking at the imperial order of and making and doing actions that have material effects towards it. And there is something to be said about the fact that the state now has to do a check-in every 4 years to vibe check, even though we know companies like Walmart have more political influence than the individual, even when organized, especially when it comes to the electoral votes.
The passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and how that was such a huge win in terms of the civil rights movement, and how that was largely like paid for by with the blood and the brutality that many of the children in Birmingham faced during the Birmingham Children's Crusade. For those who don't know, there was a whole march where children literally marched in pairs for days and days and days, spent days in jail, had hoses set on them, dogs set on them. And this was a campaign where, what the hell was it for? Was it for desegregation of schools? Oh yeah, it was to address the issue of desegregation. And I think about the fact that this major win in the civil rights movement was won for by the blood of children, and how even with the Voting Rights Act passed, the expansion of more Black people being able to vote, new leaders were able to be elected, but it still couldn't dismantle the other deeply embedded aspects of racism, whether that be economic exploitation, police violence, inadequate housing, education. All of these were central issues to the Black experience, or just the poor experience in the US, beyond even just the act of voting. And I think about how when we focus so much on one tool being our like way to, I don't know, be liberated, it ignores the fact that white supremacy and and imperialism can reform itself in so many different ways. And I mean, I think about how gerrymandering became more of a thing. I think about the fact that gentrification, mass incarceration, even other forms of voter suppression became even more prevalent, and how even if Black people had the right to vote, there was still like a cultural struggle over what our artistic production should mean. There was still a struggle over how connected we should be to other people in the diaspora, and how the right to vote, the right to participate in this political system still didn't mean that we had, I don't know, I don't know if this makes sense, but that we had a legible Black experience. And I think it's interesting that the Voting Rights Act was in 1965, and then the Black Panther Party is founded in 1966. Kwame Ture gives this speech in 1966 that's titled What We Want, and how, like, there are these questions of, like, not only how do we participate politically, but how do we operate as a community, I think is also, like, where I think...
This is also when they were having more Pan-African conferences, international conferences. Like, internationalism wasn't just... Now we could talk about how internationalism, now we have the internet, and it allows a lot more communication between different spheres of the world, and how there was a certain type to be in those settings that were able to travel and get the funding and have the organizations behind them. But I think that back then, they definitely hit the ground running when it came to like consistently having those Pan-African like social conferences.
Yeah.
Like, political.
But can you talk about the distinction in how Black folks resorted to like this Pan-Africanism or this internationalism? Like, what do you view as the deviation between like the civil rights era or moment of like relating to these struggles versus what the Black Power era was doing?
Well, I think even to talk about that, it goes back to a little bit before, and just wait, y'all, we'll have some Reconstruction episodes coming out eventually. But before it was MLK versus Martin Luther, it was W.E.B. Du Bois versus Garvey. And I think they were the civil rights movement, and a lot of the heroes that come out of that struggle come from more of that Du Bois talented 10th. At least the ones that were recognized in the beginning, shown in the light, like through MLK, or even, you know, like Rosa Parks wasn't the first Black woman to be thrown off the back of a bus, even on purpose, but it was the first one to get the news because she was more of a light-skinned Black woman.
And the other one was I believe a teen mom as well.
Yeah, and it didn't fit the narrative, you know, in a sense,
the respectable lady.
Yeah, respectability politics. And I think there's something that both Garvey and Du Bois had a respectability politics. And I think that led into this, if we're going to be negotiating with the establishment or be a part of it. And being a part of it and maintaining it held a lot of media focus, because it's something or a tool to be able to be used by the colonial forces. It's what they want. It's also a part of what we want, which is why we have to stay organized and as in community if we're ever going to be doing electoral strategies. But every colonial entity wants their own authority with the faces of the folks. You fight a green soldier with a green soldier.
Yeah.
You don't just try to.
And it literally, I guess it's just wild because I'm like, we're having this conversation about this period of time, but I'm like, it's literally just how Black people operate today. They're like, we got to worry about our own. We can't worry about those Palestinians. I'm like, what the fuck? And it's replicated again and again and again. Like,
they don't even care about the East Palestine.
Yeah, like, are we gonna fight for some of our brothers and sisters somewhere else, or is it gonna be about us, or like, where's that distinction? And I guess to just list off some of the freedom struggles that were happening in the 50s and 60s. We can think about the Algerian struggle for like independence. We can think about Congo. We can think about Angola. We can think about
Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde.
And like hella places in the Caribbean. I mean, free Jamaica.
That's where Garvey came out of, right?
And the apartheid struggle. And so I think about the fact that while all of these things were happening to Black folks in the US, there were still global struggles and manifestations of imperialism for us to still even have the opportunity to tap into, be aware of, find the space to be aware of based on our politicization and how, I don't know, it's just very interesting that the same struggles, or I guess core pillars of like the struggles for Black autonomy are still in existence. It's like, are we gonna just worry about our own shit? Or is worrying about and engaging in other struggles of liberation also going to help us?
I mean, absolutely, because that's how we do resource mobilization, is through having these networks of folks that can not only specialize, because we don't just want pure specialization, but be able to innovate and skill share and be able to have a process of actual free exchange or actual democratic exchange or non-coercive exchange of ideas. And I think something to ground like the era of moving from SNCC and the militant moving into the Black Power era is to talk about Kwame Ture. And in that speech that they gave, What We Want, on September 22nd, 1966, he was then the chair of SNCC. Just some quotes from it are, quote, "We had to begin with the politics because Black Americans are propertyless people in a country where property is valued above all. We had to work for power because this country does not function by morality, love, and nonviolence, but by power. Thus, we determined to win political power with the idea of moving on from there into activity that would have economic effects. With power, the masses could make or participate in making the decisions which govern their destinies, thus create the basic change in their day-to-day lives. But if political power seemed to be key to self-determination, it was also obvious that the key had to be thrown down a deep well many, many years earlier. Disenfranchised, maintained by racist terror, made it impossible to talk about organizing for political power in 1960. The right to vote had to be won, and the SNCC workers devoted their energies from this from 61 to 65. They set up voter registration drives in the Deep South. They created pressure for the vote by holding mock elections in Mississippi in 1963 and by helping to establish the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. That struggle was eased, though not won, with the passage of the 1965 Voters' Rights Act. SNCC workers could then address themselves to the question, who can we vote for to have our needs met? How do we make our vote meaningful? Black power means proper representation and sharing of control. It means the creation of power bases from which Black people can work to change statewide or nationwide patterns of oppression through pressure from strength instead of weakness. Politically, Black power means what it has always meant to SNCC, the coming together of Black people to elect representatives, to force those representatives to speak to their needs. It does not mean merely putting Black faces into office. A man or woman who is Black and from the slums cannot be automatically expected to speak for the needs of Black people. Most of the Black politicians we see around the country today are not what SNCC means by Black power. And I think they also, in the same speech, make a call for a Black Panther Party to be one of the new freedom organizations, and not even a month later, Black Party for Self-Defense is made.
And then I'll also read another section in this same speech further down where Toure says, integration, moreover, speaks to the problem of Blackness in a despicable way. As a goal, it has been based on complete acceptance of the fact that in order to have a decent house of education, Blacks must move into a white neighborhood or send their children to a white school. This reinforces among Blacks and whites that the idea that white is automatically better and Black is by definition inferior. This is why integration is a subterfuge for the maintenance of the white supremacy. It allows the nation to focus on a handful of Southern children who get into white schools at a great price and to ignore the 94% who are left behind in unimproved all-Black schools. Such situations will not change until Black people have the power to control their own school boards, in this case. Then Negroes become equal in a way that means something, and integration ceases to be a one-way street. And so even in this speech, I think there's all these interesting and necessary distinctions where, like, I think about how Black history, the civil rights era, simply could talk. It's like, oh, segregation ended, and then we got the right to vote. But even in this, I'm seeing all these distinctions around what segregation means, what integration means, what how these progresses still don't solve the racial caste system, and how this is something that the Black Power movement is trying to do in a way that is both sometimes tied to electoralism, but mostly is tied to gaining resources and community self-defense, and how, I don't know. I mean, I guess I've always fucked with like the turning away from like, Massa, give us what we need. And it's like, we got what we need.
And I think one thing that was mentioned, or one thing that was just talked about, is integration, making integration a two-way street. Because at this point, folks are being influenced by these third world movements, by these fourth world movements, and they're saying, well, shit, in a settler colony, you don't integrate with your colonial masters. You abolish the colonial state, and we all have to come together and govern together instead of having an apartheid or a racial caste system, or whether informal or formal, a caste system that's doing this to us.
And further down in the speech, he literally talks about like what white people should be doing. And I think this is the part where it's like integration is a two-way street. It's like, not only should Black people be trying to improve their communities, white people, he says further down, I've said that the most liberal whites react to Black power with the question, what about me? Rather than saying, tell me what you want me to do and I'll see if I can do it. There are answers to the right question. One of the most disturbing things about white supporters of the movement has been that they are afraid to go into their own communities, which is where the racism exists, and work to get rid of it, end quote. And so I think, I don't know, it's just fascinating because he's kind of giving like a guide to how to engage with electoralism, because electoralism is like how you can deal with things like legislatively or like on a like electoral level, but he's talking about the socio-political changes that people have to make to make the Black vote meaningful, which I think is what is interesting in a turn away from, I guess, a lot of like the mainstream conception of like the right to vote, civil rights, nonviolence. But
and
this
then
is actually
done. But it's a cultural. What they're talking about is a cultural revolution.
Yeah.
They're talking about the protracted people's revolution. Like they're very influenced by Mao. Yeah. They're very influenced by these revolutionaries, and because they even go on to say, mostly talking about how, and I love how this comes before the Rainbow Coalition, but they say there's a vital job to be done among poor whites. We hope to see eventually a coalition between poor Blacks and poor whites, and that is the only coalition which seems acceptable to us. And we see coalition as the major internal instrument of change within American society. End quote. And they say, but they also talk about how it's been mostly academics talking about it, and they don't really see it happening as much as it really needs to. And they talk about how they want psychological, the need for psychological equity is one of the reasons why SNCC believes that they must organize within the Black community around and conveying revolutionary ideas, especially when talking about that psychological equity of like Black people do not want to take over the country, but they want to, and they don't want to get Whitey, but they want to get him off their back, as the saying goes. And the amount of psychological distress that still happens in this country when it comes to living in that Black experience, especially because talking about culture, and they specifically in this speech talk about a movie they watched, Tarzan, where he goes and kills a bunch of Black natives, and he was cheering on for Tarzan. And now he's thinking, what the fuck was I doing? Like, now I want them to beat Tarzan's ass, ship him into the river, and hope his dead body gets to Europe.
Yeah, that reminds me of the James Baldwin quote where he says, like, you grow up in a world where you think you're the cowboy in the Western movies, and then you realize you're actually the Indian. And I'm like, oh Lord. And yeah, I mean, I think all of this is just so good for me to refresh my brain on, because it's just like, I don't know. I just think the fact that all of these things were happening alongside each other is fucking wild and fascinating. And then like to your point about like the psychosis or the psychology of even surviving the Black experience, the colonized experience. And then like, I mean, I don't know if you're ready to dig into this next part, but I mean, we do have a section where we can even talk about like as these movements for Black autonomy were shifting from like Black legal legibility to Black self-determination and community self-defense. All that was like, with all of that happening, looming in the background was also COINTELPRO. So as Black people are fighting for legal legibility, trying to build their own systems of like economics and care, in the background, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, was designed to disrupt and neutralize, like many of these organizations. It was designed to neutralize the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement, and even led to the assassination of Fred Hampton, which we've talked about on this podcast. And so, I don't know. I guess like what has been interesting, like when I was researching this episode, is like I was really trying to look at the outline through the lens of like, what wins did Black people have in terms of like autonomy and like liberation, and then also what was the white establishment doing in the background to like either co-opt the movement or to repress it on like a visible level, or on another level to like do it in the background. And I think it's interesting that, I don't know, like I think COINTELPRO is, I don't know. I guess I was really analyzing this through like, okay, like the 80s definitely brought Reagan and like a dismantling of all of these like government assistance and federal programs. And I think like hip hop and like Black culture getting more into the mainstream. And I guess I just view like the 70s onward as like this departure where not only did our movements experience like massive repression and disinformation and people were killed off, but we did kind of culturally begin to assimilate more into American culture. Does that make sense? Like we became, I don't know. And maybe for me, it's like the explosion of like TV
Is that
and mass
integration?
media. Yeah,
Of
yeah, I
like,
guess that's what I'm saying.
it's like the way that the integration happened and where things were. It was like still, like Jonina said in our last episode, school life was desegregated, but the social life was completely not. And then economic life, even longer. And then when it comes to what sort of cultural imports, and there's still cultural imports, especially when you think about the Black community, especially the like hip hop and certain arts and jazz as coming from internal sectors of like mutual aid parties and from the Harlem Renaissance of like all these grooves and things that we're talking about is another international swing and coming together of Black folks and doing rent parties and like perfecting technique there, and then being on the street and perfecting technique there and bringing that um, to the mainstream. And I think being always on the street and trying to organize is something that's sustained. To to its credit or not,
Yeah.
you know. And especially the cultural organizing, I think, is definitely somewhere or a field that, especially the diaspora, has been able to try to sustain Pan-African connections. And I didn't get to mention him before, but I wanted to just bring up Amilcar Cabral as one of these like influences that from like from Toure to the Black Panther Party and the BLA was a heavy influence. I mean, like Assata Shakur was heavily influenced by this global struggle, particularly while they were in exile in Cuba. Like they studied the writings of Cabral and other African revolutionaries, and Cabral's concept of revolutionary culture and self-determination resonated with their own struggle for Black liberation in the U.S. And Toure was heavily influenced on the emphasis of armed struggle and the unity of theory and practice. Especially after leaving the U.S., Toure moved to Guinea and worked closely with the African liberation movements led by Cabral. And Cabral was a key revolutionary leader, thinker, and nationalist who played a key role in the independence movement in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde from Portugal colonial rule. And their ideas on revolutionary theory, on struggle and cultural dimensions of liberation greatly influenced the Black militants and liberation movements around the world, but especially within the African diaspora. He was a firm believer in armed struggle and in the fight for independence, also saw it as a means to an end, but not an end in itself. He believed violence was a necessary tactic in the face of colonial repression, but placed greater emphasis on political education, organizing, and mobilizing the masses. Cabral believed that the liberation struggle was not only military or political battle, but also a cultural one, and argued that colonization strips people of their culture and identity, and reclaiming these elements was essential for liberation. And his favorite, he has a quote that is, "The culture is the seed of resistance," and it's emphasized by that revolutionary process that involved restoring dignity and cultural identity to the colonized. And for them, culture was both a weapon and a form of resistance and a source of unity among oppressed people, making it essential for sustaining these revolutionary movements, especially against such a strong and heavily technologically advanced colonial entity. They were really prominent in international solidarity, really emphasizing the connections between liberation struggles in Africa, Asia, Latin America, fighting imperialism and fighting their own capital exploitation. And he understood that the fight against colonialism was the global struggle and envisioned one global solidarity against imperialism and capitalism. And I think being able to name the kind of histories and look back and understand what really made them flourish and thrive throughout history lets us know lets us keep certain parts of a revolutionary fire lit in a collective way and in a collective meaning, especially when it comes around like the use of violence as a tool and militancy, but also understanding what political violence is, and not only just looking at it as something that is enacted onto us, but something that can be enacted and isn't only just spontaneous, but can be organized and can be accountable. um, but really working through what that looks like, I think, is a revolutionary process, because there's no way to do that other than to be in the streets, door knocking, getting people to meetings, getting people's voices if they can't be at meetings, discussing, deliberating, and then making actions and plans to really move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. And that's kind of why I think COINTELPRO being in the background and destabilizing all of these movements and locking people away. And I don't know, of course, like the movement in air quotations wasn't destroyed, but I do think it's interesting to look at like all of the systemic violence that these movements faced, how it fractured a lot of those understandings, how some of those understandings survived. And I think just like looking at what the 80s and 90s especially represented for Black life, we can look at the rise of neoliberalism, which is like a political and economic and ideology framed around free market capitalism, deregulation, reducing government spending, and how this rose in dominance, especially through Ronald Reagan, who really like pushed the welfare queen narrative and cut all sorts of programs and reduced government kind of intervention into social issues that were happening in the Black community. And then I think about that happening alongside like the rise of hip hop, the rise of Black popular culture, how like in the 80s and 90s, yeah, and how in the 80s and 90s, like Black film and TV also exploded, how Black sports became even more of a relevant thing, the war on drugs setting the stage with the crack and cocaine epidemic, and we can look at the sentencing disparities. And so it's just interesting when I look at it in that way, where I'm like, the Black America of the 60s and 70s literally had no fucking clue what was coming. And then I think about the 80s and 90s through the lens of like all these things happening and like it forcing communities to like really have to survive within their own boundaries, and how, I don't know, experiencing systemic violence was also a form of integration. I don't know, like because it forced us more into having to survive the narrative of what this country offers to us, even outside of like
the weaponization of that narrative of us saying like we're not shitting on these great Black leaders that got us the right to vote. We're shitting on people who take that image and say that if we don't vote and if we don't use this tool in a way that is useful for the establishment, that we are shitting on their legacy then. When really, and because we, like you were saying, we have 80 years or 100 years of context from when this movement started. I mean, not even really, but like we have 300 years of context. And at this point, what we can hope for from empire is more greatly informed, and the information to have that is way more accessible, that we can't keep looking at state focused solutions as if they are political autonomy. And the thing is, like you were saying, some people stayed in the house. Not everybody wants to enact political autonomy. I mean, when I think about, anarchism specifically, when it comes to labor organizing, not everybody wants self-management. Not everybody wants, and can you blame them? Some people just want to clock in, clock out. But does that mean that there's then an economy and a system ready for people? And in a better system, how much work would somebody really need to do if other needs are met and they could clock in, clock out and do something else? It'd be a different cultural expansion. It'd be a whole different thing, but that needs to be done internally and with other folks. And that's like the person to person and block by block organizing that these revolutionaries were doing. And when they were building the power and the issue for the black vote, they were talking about black power as something way more directly democratic. We will force you to represent our needs. And if not, you know what that means? We'll get you the fuck out. They still do that in Trinidad. I had a homie that was just telling me, man, somebody fucked up their thing on some bribery and commission. People were at his house. He was wrapped up the next day. He wasn't dead, but he got a lick. And the thing is like, there's a lot more, and whether we feel about the violence and that accountability, blah, 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 but it's a lot more of a recallable and accountable position. And that's just not what the state actually is. That's not what our state actually is. Our version of this representative republic is not the utopic and democratic dream that comes from Black radical tradition.
What has shifted our conceptions of Black life, Black voting, Black autonomy, and how has it led to the reality of the Black vote today? And I guess just looking through some of our notes, I think about since we can see that the system, that white supremacy, that imperialism has continuously replicated its forms of violence, militarism, repression, in what ways can Black autonomy be gained now? And thinking of the Black Power legacy, considering the ways that the state repressed Black Power movements, anti-war movements, the advent of the war on drugs, Black commercialization. Yet in the face of all of this, I think about I don't know, I guess I just think about from the 2000s onward, that's our lives. And I guess, I don't know if we want to enter the last section of this, but I really am thinking of the question of what have we learned in our lifetimes in terms of the state, its capacity to help us, our capacity to participate, and what have been some of our kind of major flashpoints in that understanding. I guess it's just one big question I have for the last section, and I don't know what else you'd want to talk about too.
Well, with the extension of movements from the 70s and 80s and the impact organizing wise that it's had on now is this importance of prisoner support and legal defense work. And I think even there are some people who have varying definitions of political prisoners, politicized prisoners, and folks like that. But I think especially as a mass mobilizing effort, I remember I've worked for some Black organizations, did some door knocking for some community for some community meetings, and realized we need to switch the whole flip for the community meetings. I know just from canvassing that 1 in 9 people have a kid in juvie in Ohio, just in Linden. So, and their rights are being abused. So what, therefore, as a community can we do to organize around those children? Is, I think,
so in another,
instead of creating a party, create defense or community care in these ways.
I think in other words, how can we do the work to disentangle ourselves from anti-Black and state violence?
Yeah, absolutely. And and these are spaces where we can have vulnerable conversations, spaces where we can have hard conversations, where we can meet each other's material needs, where we can find out, just meet each other, find out different things. And still, I think there is a need for, because the one thing about voting is I love voting in my organizations or in these groups and affinity groups I'm a part of, and it's a big part of how I materially feel politically satisfied in my day-to-day life. And I think being able to have that is very important, because one thing I was doing some research for this is there's this dude in a prison. I can't remember the name of it. I'll link it in the show notes, but it's a documentary. It's 15, 17 minutes long, and he runs mock elections inside of prisons. And he does it just so that people, especially because a lot of the folks there can't vote, because in the state that they're in, they're disenfranchised to vote. So they run these mock elections, and he does this whole thing where they register people to vote. You got to get it in at a certain time. And he's very adamant about, it's not that you have to vote. And if you want to turn in a ballot that says you don't vote for anyone, we encourage you to do that as well. It's the power of voting and enacting a democratic process in a communal way, in a collective way, that is governing without a state. That is checking in. That is creating temperature checks for leadership or leaderful structures, which don't have to be centrally maintained based on its monopoly of violence. There are certain aspects that I think that live in that Black radical tradition that led to the energy of us getting a vote, and having this sort of political utility within the state. And that utility will continue to be used and abused. But it's also just, I mean, I must want to say it. I think that's what I was trying to say earlier with so many corporations having more impact, but the state now has to have a vibe check. So we can now look and be like, okay, well, a third of people aren't voting. This many people do, and it's more of an accurate political temperature check. Because you can look and see a third of people aren't voting, and then half of the 2/3 that are voting that are eligible are folks that, and then it's pretty much split 55-45 between elections. So it's can barely decide, and it's not even everyone, and other people are voting or not voting for a multitude of different reasons, and those are eligible voters. So we're not even talking about people who are under 18, people who have their voting rights stripped away from them. And I just think about how those different dynamics are being used, and also alongside the cultural and colonial counter-revolutionary forces of the state, of how COINTELPRO evolves from what it was to what it is now, and how we saw it evolved into red squads in certain, especially when the Black Power movement was happening, and there was definitely more, and in the 90s, seeing departments specifically just for protests and departments specifically just for radicals within local police departments.
Yeah. And I guess one thing I've been taking notes of different things I want to hit in this section, but even before all of the political shit, I just think about social media, the internet, and the rise of our current conception of Black capitalism. And I guess this is where I keep going back to integration. I'm not only did we have conceptions of Black self-determination and capitalism throughout these different eras of Black autonomy and progression, but now we have our own iteration as well. It's rappers and basketball players and celebrities that turn into billionaires, and how even on a media level, you can become someone of value or clout or of wealth through having a platform, and how all of these forms of self-determination that are tied to capital are also a form of assimilation into Americanism, white supremacy, and how that is already a major cultural blockage. Because I guess that's why I think about I wrote down the question what is a Black decolonial approach beyond even any hope of giving meaning to the Black vote. And I think about like how Black capitalism is like the thing we're still fighting against. But then, okay, and then there's that thing, like Black capitalism, but then like going through some of my other notes, like I'm just thinking of like the meaning of the Black vote within my lifetime. And I think about like how I grew up watching my parents vote or thinking about voting, and then Obama becoming this presidential candidate, and how that was kind of as many of us were coming of age, or at least like when Obama first ran, I think I was like in high school. And then when he ran again, I was in college. And I think about how I came of age through that political reality where I was young. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I bought into like this dream or this idea, like it was very attractive, and how at least like in my lifetime, like post-Obama, I'm like, fuck all of this. Cause like more police murders, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner.
They say it's a charm. We just gotta wait for the one after Kamala. Will it be us?
No.
Oh my god, but what if we ran? Wait.
Someone's gonna play this.
You're vice president, I'm
vice
No,
president?
I'm VPing.
Okay.
I didn't get to vote for you.
Vote Bear, Bobcats for Accountability, Affordability, Responsibility, and Empowerment. It was a nude campaign in college. But yeah, so I think about like how Obama shifted the meaning of Black participation, because I don't know, I think essentially like post-Obama, I think the question of decolonial Black identity becomes even more important, because it's like, now we can really be the empire, bitch. It's like, not only did they want a Black man to be president, they want a Black woman, and then next it's going to be a Black disabled trans person.
We've already had a disabled president. It's funny because he actually didn't let the world know. It was Roosevelt. Roosevelt, because he was like the outdoorsy man.
Lung?
I think maybe that, and he also had to sit in a chair.
I think there was a show about him. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and he was like too scared to let people know because he couldn't be like the manzy outdooring pro-conservation, especially if conservation was their way to like take indigenous land and hold it in trust within the federal government's way. But I also think of what you first mentioned, and I think about looking back at what folks were doing. Like Fannie Lou Hamer was also starting farming co-ops. Ella Baker was also starting buying co-ops and market and grocery stores. And these are like the ways that people were directly intervening with how capital intervenes with their distribution, production, and consumption of their day-to-day material needs. And I think being able to look at that again, and I think like with the advent of free stores, especially free stores come out of a Black anarchist tradition, at least through like the distro thing of coming from and inspiring a lot of white anarchists to do them, come from the Intercada tradition. And of just like the Black tradition of just like being in community. I mean, somebody's out there, somebody's
cooking plates, you're passing it around your neighborhood, or you want my kids' clothes, they grew out of them. I think of that, and I think there's so many different histories we can pull from, and I think it's even more important to pull from, because I've also wrote down the phrase like the internet age, the continuous refraction of Black violence, and the increased awareness of Black rage. And I do think that is something that in my lifetime, I think the movements that have arisen, parts of the movements that I've been most attracted to have been the more anarchic ones, the most militant ones. And I think about the fact that like since Rodney King, lynchings were a refraction of Black violence and subjugation on a public media level. The war on drugs also was a fraction of that. But I also think with the internet age and social media and the parasocial nature of anti-Black violence, I think about the fact that like, I don't know, like I really think 2020 and how angry people were in the first days of political violence, like something about that really, I don't know, I guess I just kept thinking back to the 60s and how I think maybe now what I feel is the possibility of turning away from the Black vote is towards like a justifiable Black rage or a Black militancy. Like we've been talking about militancy a lot, and how, I don't know, maybe that's something I'm trying to spend my life building towards, especially around election years. Because I'm like, I'm not really going to tell anyone like, you're voting, you're a piece of shit, you're a part of the empire. I'm more going to be like, That's fine. You can vote. But also, like, what about dismantling these systems or having some idea of what a more pessimistic approach would be, or something that is like, and I guess that's where the decolonial aspect comes in, because I do believe maybe we're experiencing a moment in time where an era in time where I think if Black folks dig more into our decolonial approach to like freeing ourselves, we can begin to really turn away from thinking that electoralism will help us or save us. Because if the inevitable outcome is that the state will continue to try to destroy us, what do you call the process of upending yourself from that system? And I don't think voting is a part of that.
I don't think voting is necessarily a part of. I don't think voting is a necessary part of the decolonial struggle in this context right now, especially if we want to talk about indigenous solidarity, especially if we want to talk about how do we actually deal with the realities of this settler colonial nation while it still treats its literal colonies and literal internal colonies, internal quote unquote colonies, reservations, and all that jazz. Like, I think there is this beautiful zine from Indigenous Action called Voting is Not Harm Reduction. And the word harm reduction are lesser of two evils, and making the settler colonial democracy more participatory so we can all get a little hand in that bloody bucket doesn't seem like it breaks anti-authoritarian boundaries to me. And I think that's, I guess, something to work towards, is envisioning and having a collective or a political entity or engagement or process to really engage folks outside of electorals politics, which is one thing socially that like the Black Panther Party and social movement organizations give the people chance to like attempt prefigurative politics or attempt to even find community or just relations around or in alignment with their moral and ethics, and then build towards that, whether they do it hierarchically or non-hierarchically. That's been a through line of like, through that struggle, people will find a way to make their voices heard through organizing and collectivizing. And the vote is not our only way or tool, especially not decolonial against the United States. Because I mean, like, even if we get Tim Walz in, it doesn't mean land back. It doesn't mean everything progressive and like quote unquote progressive in Minnesota is going to happen across the board federally. And it doesn't really mean that Black or Indigenous sovereignty will be a thing, because it's not really part of the public conversation where it has to be a thing. They can ignore it still at this point. And I think that's something to be said, moving beyond the ballot or like the types of organizing that has to be done that attacks that question of the ballot's usefulness.
Radicalism in a lot of ways, because of the movements of the last like 20 years, Black radicalism especially, like when I think about Black Lives Matter and police reform and dash cams and body cams and community dialogue councils and whatever the fuck, Black people are still dying. And I think Black radicalism, at least in the last 20 years, has been able to acknowledge, like, for some, legislation and electoralism is the continued path to try to mediate some of those conditions. And for other people, it's not that. It's another form of resistance. It's something more antagonistic. It's being a part of Black Bloc or beating up a politician or fucking, I don't know, shutting down an intersection or just disrupting the status quo as it stands, and having that be grounds for people to gather, for people to resort to a justifiable resistance. And I think it's also allowed for a deeper conversation around what does it mean to be a Black body through the process of colonization, which I think is where like we are maybe deepening some of the conversations around Pan-Africanism and how I think it's tied to that. And I think the decolonial question is to the point of indigenous solidarity. It's to the point of how do we help other global struggles of liberation. And I think Black radicalism is more trying to engage in that more seriously. I think some people are trying to, I don't know, hold ground on a public level. I mean, I don't really follow Ta-Nehisi Coates that much, but I know he's held his ground in his newest book, The Message. He was berated by journalists on like this morning show, and I think there's more of a conversation around Black complicity with the empire, or at least I feel like I'm trying to engage in those conversations, and that to me is of great utility because that's where I think like there's numerous paths forward. There's the path where we change the representative democracy and we change the oligarchy, or we present another party, or we get our own nation or empire, or we separate, or we, I don't know, like just leave and move somewhere else, or we fucking topple the empire.
And I think that's something that has been a big conflict within Black radicalism, of like the whole thing of like Black separatism, Black nationalism. What does this mean? The Republic of New Africa. Is this just our ethno state? Like at one point, there were a point where the RNA had to deal with the settler colonial dynamics of what they were proposing and what they were trying to militantly force the states into recognizing, and how even that would be complicit in the genocide of indigenous folks. It slows down the process, but deepens the relationships and ability for it to like sustain itself. In a way that's beyond that, in a way that like actually takes breaking down empire and the urge for democracy. Like we're talking about co-optation and a lot of these movements. Democratic Party, this is our vision of democracy. Like this is how the word is most colloquially known or used, and this cannot, in my eyes, be acceptable. Like I have my own issues with democracy being very vague, but I do think, like especially when we get down to like direct democracy, especially with technological advancements that we have, being the feasibility of it to do it at small and at other scales, when it comes to, I think one big point of political education that should be focused on, especially within looking at this history, we see the democratic urge and really defining that within the Black radical tradition through people who wanted to engage in the state, through the Black Panther Party, through the Communist Party, through just getting people the ability to vote and being able to be registered. There was a point in which they had to like reach down to folks and say, your vote matters because your voice matters. And that means you have to not just be quiet. And I think continuing that line of logic of we're not invisible, we also have to be visibly organized in that manner as well, to really hold that collective and political power. And I think that's a lot of what what Joe Nina said. We don't need to do the Black Panther Party, but there is certain things around framing, around political engagement, around resource mobilization, around like care and other sorts of actions and community things. Yeah, exactly. I mean, their whole thing was to do a prefigurative thing in Oakland and just get that captured so that other folks can see it, and it'll be the spark and the nucleus and the vanguard for the revolution.
Whether or not you're voting, it's important to still be experimenting, building alternatives, thinking about how we can self-govern. Like, I don't know, by any means necessary, and for some people through engaging with the system as it is to change like a variety of material conditions. So I agree with that, and I think that's kind of like a good place to kind of end on. And I guess a question I have is, I mean, it's October, early October 2024. Are you voting? Are you registered?
I'm not registered to vote. I've seen fascists tracked down through their ability to be that and other things. And You know, there was a point in time where I used to say I do more for the movement than just voting. At that point, I was also doing like voter registration stuff. But I mean, I did vote for Biden in 2020. That was my first vote ever. I had just become, able to vote. I just got flashbanged. I was doing a bunch of political education, and I was just like, Trump's scary. Can't do Trump. Like, this is fascism. We have to get rid of it. And it's not even that I regret it for some like moral value, because I do think that if there's any reason to vote, because like one thing too is like organized well and organized collectively, you can have, and generationally, you can have an impact on the state through legitimate grassroots sustained generational work. You've seen it in the conservative movement, and this is like the sort of things that is why we have so many homegrown fascists. It's not hard for them because they can just lean in on all these tropes and all these other things and build the quote unquote masses to whatever they want them to be, or need to be for their quote unquote tradition or nostalgia. And that's like the issue with a lot of nostalgia politics and those that are on the front end of that, because it's sustaining a point of exploitation. Because at every point, we have been exploiting from this earth and from the people around us more than we have been able to one even use. I mean, the amount of excess and waste from the American project is fucking terrible. But there needs to be some sort of reckoning with that.
So would you say we need a progressive populism?
I would say we need democratic confederalism based around bioregions. Absolutely.
Okay, and I guess I'll respond to the am I voting question. I do think a lot of people don't talk about like when you sign up to fucking register, who fucking has your information? Who could have your information? So I think that's a fucking sublime point. For me, I'm not going to vote because it just fucking pisses me off so fucking much. It's like every fucking presidential election, you're black, your people fought for it. You have to save us, save them. And I'm like, who's gonna save me? Who is gonna save fucking me? And the fact that everyone's being like, you need to vote, like the lesser evil. I'm like, most of the people that tell you to fucking vote for the lesser evil, they usually aren't gonna be out there fighting fucking fascism. And if someone's recommending that I participate in the fucking system given to me, you better be prepared to come in my defense when the system will inevitably fuck me up or someone else up. And if you're not, shut the fuck up. That's what I say. Hey listeners, this is Prince here, and I'm here to give you a reminder that if you want to support the Dugout and our anarchist musings about the world, politics, and culture, you can find us in a couple of ways. Our anarchist podcast is shaking things up, and we want you to be a part of the action. So here's how you can support. When you support us on Patreon, you get early access to episodes and special live streams. So to do that, head to patreon.com/the Dugout Pod. Throw in your support and let's keep the vibes going. And then if you want to follow us on social media, on Instagram or TikTok, find us at the Dugout Pod to hear our behind the scenes musings. Sometimes we share some weird reading. Sometimes we're smoking it down and you can join us. But in general, sharing is caring. So let people you know about the Dugout Podcast. If there's particular episodes that you think someone might get some kind of wisdom or knowledge from, send it to them. And find us online and stay tuned for another episode.